Cheers, Rockets fans. Welcome to The Locker Line, an exclusive podcast from the home of the Rockets.
Whoa!
Sports Talk 790.
Rockets!
The Locker Line is proudly served to you by Carbox Clutch City Lager.
It is good! Oh, yeah?
Red Nation, get ready. Get ready. The Locker Line starts now.
Welcome aboard.
Welcome back to a special mini-cast episode of The Locker Line, as always served to you courtesy of Houston's Carback Brewing. I'm Ben Dubose, your host, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire, and contributor to Sports Talk 790, official flagship radio station of your Houston Rockets. We're talking midday Wednesday, June 25th, draft day around the NBA. We're going to have a mini-cast today responding to the Rockets getting Fred VanVleet on a new contract, 2 years, $50 million with a player option next summer. Phenomenal work by Rafael Stone and the Rockets front office. If you go back to our Locker Line archives, I had thought that 3 years for $90 to $100 million was where this deal would likely come in at when you factor in how dependent the Rockets are on Fred VanVleet, and that's even more so after adding Kevin Durant. I thought Fred would draw a hard line in the sand in these negotiations because there was no world where the Rockets would want to let him go for no compensation and not have him on their roster next season. That would be devastating, especially now that you have a clear win-now emphasis around a 36-year-old superstar in KD. So I thought Fred would basically negotiate off of what would have been a $45 million salary. That was the team option figure, because obviously the Rockets were not going to let him walk, and then try and add more onto that for year two and perhaps year three. All that really happened was that he added $5 million more in guaranteed money. Now, I guess he does get the player option next summer, which gives him some leverage to potentially recoup some of this at that time. But by and large, what happened here, Fred VanVleet lowered his annual salary next year from potentially $45 million all the way down to $25 million. And all he's getting in additional guaranteed money is $5 million more. The bottom line, he just did the Rockets a solid. And I guess this speaks to the power of relationships in the modern NBA. And maybe it's something we'll see more with salaries exploding at the rate they have in recent years, and Fred making above $40 million in each of the last two seasons. Maybe he's at a point where he's made enough money that he's willing to give some of it back to help the team have a better chance of contending for a championship around him, because ultimately that's what this does. And maybe we'll see it later this offseason with Kevin Durant. We heard Shams sort of hint at, he did an appearance on the Pat McAfee show on Monday. Shams hinted at the possibility that KD might give a little bit of money back, sign for below the max, so that the Rockets could put the best possible roster around him. Now, he's not going to sign for nothing. The same is true with Fred. There's a balance between giving something back while also being compensated fairly. But the bottom line, this Houston roster is going to get much more expensive as the years progress. Alperen Sengun is going to be on the first year of his extension next season. The year after that, Jabari Smith and Tari Eason. The year after that, Amen Thompson will almost certainly be on a full max contract. So every dollar you can save for guys like Kevin Durant and Fred VanVleet, your veterans, it's important. And perhaps these are guys that have already earned so much over their careers and clearly want to contend for championships. Maybe that makes them all the more likely, because strictly financial negotiating leverage, Fred could have gotten a better deal than this. But what happened here by lowering his annual value from as much as $45 million down to $25, that gives the Rockets significant space beneath the luxury tax, which is important on a couple of fronts. For starters, it delays when your clock will start as far as the repeater tax penalties and everything that comes with the new collective bargaining agreement in the NBA and how restrictive it can be from a team building perspective to teams that are consistently spending well into the luxury tax and beyond. You hear second apron all the time these days, and it's because these teams that get super expensive, unless they're winning at a crazy high level, and sometimes even if they are, but certainly if they aren't, we're seeing it with teams like Boston and Phoenix selling off. So the longer you can wait on having a super expensive team, the better. But more importantly, when it comes to what I think you as fans care about the most, which is, can the Houston Rockets win a championship as soon as next season? By not going into luxury tax territory, the Rockets have access to the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which starts at an annual salary of about $14 million. And they can use that to backfill either, however you look at it, the Jalen Green spot or the Dillon Brooks slot. Because when the Rockets did the KD trade, they sent out 2 starters in Jalen and Dillon for 1 in KD. So even if KD is better, and he certainly is, he's not going to fill everything that Jalen and Dillon gave you last season. And those were 2 above average starters. Let's not act like these were bad players. They were not by any stretch of the imagination. There are minutes to fill, and you could have gambled on Cam Whitmore. I'll get to him in a minute to fill those. But if you want to compete at the highest level, it makes sense to bring in someone in free agency, which they can now, that has a higher floor, that is much more certain and able to help you win now. So you look at wing players who could replace Dillon Brooks. I think you should probably look at it as KD replacing Jalen Green, because even if they're not technically the same position, we're talking about the same role, the leading scorer, the A1. So it's backfilling the Dillon role that we're largely talking about now in terms of 3 and D. So you can look at someone like a Nickeil Alexander-Walker, a Gary Trent Jr., who's not necessarily a defender, but he is an elite 3-point shooter, high volume, almost 42% last year. And perhaps you don't need as much defense because you can scale up Tari Eason to fill some of that Dillon role. So someone like a Gary Trent Jr., a Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Bruce Brown, who I think has some past history with Ime Udoka, or maybe it's just that Ime has spoken well of him, but he certainly feels like an Ime player. Those are options that, with having access to the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception in an environment where not many teams have salary cap space at all, are suddenly very realistic candidates to join the Rockets next season. I do not have any intel just yet on which it's likely to be, but these are options that, leading up to the June 30th date in which you can negotiate all around the league externally with other teams' free agents, I think those are the types of players that you're going to hear, and those are the options that conceivably could fill the other spot, with KD stepping in for Jalen Green in terms of role, and whoever you could sign with the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is suddenly available to you with Fred's annual salary going down so much, that could, to some extent, replace the Dillon role. So this gives the Rockets a ton of spending power that we didn't think they would have going into this offseason. It's going to be fascinating to see what they do with it. Now, I will say, while they have access to the full non-taxpayer mid-level exception, I don't think you will see them go crazy in terms of total years on any deal they give out. It's not a coincidence that the Fred VanVleet deal is for 2 years. And that's because there is some concern about the 27 to 28 season, which will be the start of Amen Thompson's max extension, and the second year of whatever extension Kevin Durant gets. That's where this payroll could go well beyond the luxury tax, perhaps into the second apron. And so they've got to be very careful with the money they have on the books for that season. It either needs to be cheap enough to where the player would clearly have positive trade value, i.e. they could easily offload it, or ideally not be on the books at all to give them maximum flexibility. So I think what you'll see the Rockets do is offer the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, but for 1 or 2 years. Or perhaps it'll be one of those situations where they offer it technically for 3 or 4 years, and the player's agent acts like, oh, you got the full NTMLE for 3 or 4 years. But then you learn later on that after year 2, there's a team option. The Rockets are going to prioritize flexibility, because when Amen starts his max deal at 30% of the cap, and Kevin Durant is still in all likelihood on the books. We heard Shams say on Monday, that same Pat McAfee interview, that both KD and the Rockets plan on him finishing his career in Houston, which makes all the sense in the world at his age, and with the win now emphasis that the Rockets are clearly in, coming off a 52-30 season, number 2 in the West, and now you're adding an all-star, former MVP, future Hall of Famer, all of that good stuff. They are worried about 27 and beyond, what that payroll is going to look like. Now, it'll probably resolve itself, at least to some extent, when KD inevitably retires or scales down his role because he's not capable of being a star anymore. But whatever seasons you have KD at near peak form and all of your young guys on their second contracts, most notably Amin Thompson, getting into max territory, that's where financially it could be very tricky for this team. They're going to have a very fine line to walk. And so I think that's why Fred's deal is only 2 years. I would be very surprised if you see the Rockets give out the non-taxpayer MLE for more than 2 years guaranteed because of how it would limit them down the line. But even if it's only 2 years guaranteed, I think that's going to be pretty powerful in an environment where not many teams have cap space at all. Not many teams have access to the full non-taxpayer MLE for that matter. And those that do probably aren't in as good a position to win as the Rockets are. In fact, the Rockets might be the best team on the market that can offer for those types of players both money and a chance to contend. The only team that's clearly, when you look at the odds, ahead of the Rockets in the championship hierarchy next season is Oklahoma City, which obviously just won the 2025 NBA Finals. Congratulations to them. And the Thunder have a full rotation as is. So I don't think you'll see them looking to add the same types of players. The Rockets are as good or better than anyone in terms of their likelihood of contending that they're going to be competing with on the open market. And no one has more money other than, I think the only team that has a ton of money is Brooklyn, and they're nowhere near contending. And so they're probably, even if they do spend that money, it's not a guarantee that they'll do it in free agency. They could look to take on bad deals via trade and get draft equity for doing so. We know that playbook. But even if Brooklyn did look to spend it, I highly doubt they're looking for the win now role player type guys that are available, late 20s, early 30s, the types of guys that the Rockets will be looking for to backfill that Dillon Brooks role. The analogy that I've used in recent pods is I think you can probably find someone that gave you 80% of Dillon Brooks's production for 50% of the price. That's pretty much what's going to happen here, I think, in that Dillon was making low 20s in average annual value. You're going to be replacing him largely with this non-taxpayer mid-level exception slot, which will be $13, $14 million a year in average annual value. I mean, it's a little above 50%, but not much. And I think you'll be getting much closer to 100% when we're talking about the totality of their contributions. The point is you can get some real quality players here. And so what your rotation will look like in all likelihood is Fred, KD, Amin, Jabari, and Şengün as your starter. I've heard that Jabari Smith is likely to go back to the starting lineup now. And then your top reserves will be Tari Eason, Steven Adams, Reed Shepherd as your backup point guard. Small chance that you could have Aaron Holiday still around as an insurance policy, but I think they'll give every opportunity to Reed. And then with whoever you sign with the non-taxpayer MLE slot filling spot 9, that gets me to what I think is another ripple effect. And while it's not a given, the Rockets are never going to do a bad value deal. That's something Rafael Stone really believes in. They're not going to offload somebody just to offload them. But I do think it's at least possible that we could be approaching the end of the Cam Whitmore stint in Houston. We know there were some questions already in terms of, the fit with Ime Udoka. There was an awkward question at the postseason press conference about the Rockets being very clear with Cam what they needed from him to consistently play, and Ime not knowing where the lack of clarity that Cam alluded to came from because the Rockets feel like they've been very direct with him. That in and of itself was a little eyebrow raising. But aside from any baggage from the last 2 years, what it comes down to is minutes. Assuming health, you can only play 9 guys major minutes. We saw this last year when the Rockets wanted to carve out more minutes for Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore, but they couldn't, at least not consistently. Well, if you use the non-taxpayer MLE and your bench now consists of Tari, Steven, this new signing as your 9th guy, Cam Whitmore suddenly is in slot 10 at best. And I just don't think that's the best way to use his value going into year 3. Consider that after the season ends, Cam will actually be eligible for a contract extension the same year as Amin Thompson. And as I mentioned earlier, that's a key inflection point for the Rockets financially. And I should also mention that Tari and Steven, unlike last year, are not believed to have any medical restrictions going into this coming year. So we talked about how difficult it was for guys like Reed and Cam to play last year. That was with Tari and Steven being a little bit limited. This year, there aren't expected to be any of those limitations. the way things are shaping up, assuming the Rockets use that non-taxpayer mid-level exception, Cam is currently your number 10 player at best. I don't think, assuming he has reasonable value around the league, and I think he will based on what he's shown in flashes over his first 2 seasons, I don't think keeping him in a just-in-case, break glass in case of emergency role is what's best to maximize that value. Because at some point, you're going to have to get clarity. Again, he's extension eligible after this coming season. You don't want to lose him for no compensation. And quite frankly, in this scenario where you keep him at the end of the bench and there's no consistent playing time, he might want to leave because he simply wants an opportunity to play more. So it's not necessarily fair to Cam, and it's not great for you in that, either he wants to leave or you then have to pay him a much higher salary when you're not even sure what his long-term value is, and it's a spot where you're not even consistently playing him. Is it worth it to pay Cam big money when he hasn't consistently proven that he's capable of having a consistent role for Ime Udoka, and you don't even have a role for him to consistently play? I think if he's not going to consistently play this year, in year 3, it makes all the sense in the world to move him where he can play so that whoever has him going into his extension eligible offseason has a better indication of what his long-term value might be, also has a spot for him in the long-term rotation to where it would be worth it to them to make that type of investment. And from a Houston standpoint, perhaps they trade back into the draft tonight. We heard Danielle Lerner of the Houston Chronicle report on Tuesday that the Rockets had a few guys they were monitoring. Brooklyn in particular has 3 picks in the 20s now after all of that dealing. I highly doubt they roster 5 first-round picks. So I could see the Rockets perhaps shopping Cam Whitmore to Brooklyn for a pick in the 20s if one of their guys falls. Or maybe it's trading Cam for a future pick. The point is you reset if you trade for a future pick, there's no contract on the books at all. And if you trade for a pick in tonight's draft, that player is on your books, but 2 years earlier than Cam. So you're 3 years from any extension considerations. And also, it's easier not to play the guy. If you bring in a rookie, if you bring in, say, Cedric Howard, let's say he falls into the late teens, early 20s. That's someone I've heard the Rockets have some level of interest in. If you were to bring in Cedric Howard, it wouldn't be a hit to his development. It wouldn't be awkward. It wouldn't be a hit to your long-term optionality if you don't play him or if you send him to the G League. If you send year 3 Cam Whitmore to the G League or if you don't play him, it's not good for his development. It's not good for your long-term finances because you need to figure out what he's worth because he's soon going to be up for an extension. It just doesn't make sense. As opposed to a rookie, yeah, you can buy more time, reset the contractual clock. It's just a much cleaner fit. And then if you trade for a future pick, in particular, I think having a 2026 pick, which the Rockets currently don't have any, a 26 pick would give you optionality because as things stand, you couldn't trade both of your 27 assets if a really good player came available. Or maybe you trade Cam for a bunch of seconds to replace all the seconds that you had outgoing in the Kevin Durant deal a few days ago. Ideally, you'd get a first-round pick for Cam, and I think what he's shown you in flashes the first 2 years is worthy of that. But, beggars can't be choosers when it pertains to market value. We'll have to see in the coming days. But the point is, if the Rockets go out and bring in, and I said the other day on the pod that I'd be inclined to stay the course and play Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore in those 8th and 9th spots off the bench. The reason I said that was because I didn't think the Rockets would have anywhere near non-taxpayer MLE resources to fill that spot externally. I thought we'd be talking about guys that are available for, pennies on the trade market or maybe taxpayer MLEs. In this scenario, yeah, the calculus changes because you can bring in a real difference maker with this sudden NT MLE availability that stands for obviously non-taxpayer level exception. So Cam, I like him as a player, as a person. He's been really good. Paul George had a podcast right after the KD trade where he talked about how he couldn't believe that Cam didn't play more last year, and he thought he might be one of the better players in the Rockets. He could be. But the fit has never seemed perfect. The Rockets have a lot of good young players already. You might bring in another, at least somewhat young player with the MLE, and you might can trade for a pick in tonight's draft. It doesn't have to happen tonight. Well, let's be clear about that. Like tonight, the draft is always an inflection point if the right guy falls. But if the Rockets ultimately use that MLE, I'm skeptical on whether it makes sense to keep Cam Whitmore on this roster. Not because he's not a good basketball player. It's just the fit. In year 3, it does not make sense to have him at the 10th spot or lower on your bench. If you're going to have Cam on your roster, the best way to maximize that value spot, and maximizing value is going to be more important to the Rockets with how expensive they're getting. The best way to maximize that value, let him play to see what you've got. If the minutes are not going to consistently be there, then in my opinion, the value is better if you move on and you get either a pick tonight, future pick, future seconds, whatever the case may be, and you sort of reset the clock, both from a development perspective and from a contractual perspective. So that's the other ripple effect to watch out for. Cam was something the lottery ticket, fell to number 20 a couple of years ago. It's great if it works out. It's great if the fit is there, but they were never counting on him to 100% be a long-term fixture here. Anyway, that'll do it for today's episode. Just want to give a quick overview. Again, Fred, he's really doing the Rockets a solid. It's going to open up a lot more financial pathways to have a better team around them. And then as your young guys get into their second contracts, Amen, Şengün, Jabari, Tari, Fred taking a little bit less, and hopefully KD taking a little bit less later this offseason will give you a little bit of wiggle room to mitigate or blunt the impact of your young guys getting more expensive. So bottom line, another really great day for Rafael Stone in the Rockets front office, and you should be feeling really good about this offseason and really this entire franchise if you're a fan. This upcoming season is going to be really fun, and the Rockets should be in full contention mode. Not that they weren't trying to win before, but with 36, soon to be 37-year-old Kevin Durant, yeah, they're really trying to win now. And so that's going to make analyzing the rest of the offseason much more eventful and fun, because now we know the Rockets are going to be looking for every last advantage they can find if they truly try to pursue a championship. They are all in right now, and I couldn't be more excited to see this play out. Anyway, this is where I will break for today. Again, this episode of mini-cast reaction to the new Fred VanVleet deal. We'll have more extended reaction in our next full show, likely with Paolo Alves. But until we have our next full show, if you want to keep in touch with me or ask any follow-up questions, the best place to do that is on social media. I am on Blue Sky at Ben Dubose. The show is on Twitter/X at The Logger Line. You can also follow Rockets Wire, the blog for USA Today Sports Media Group, where I'm the editor, on Twitter/X at The Rockets Wire, or just go to the website, rocketswire.usatoday.com, for all of your daily Houston Rockets news coverage. Also, those links and more, you can also find them at the link tree, which is in the bio. Got links to friends, sponsors, partners of the program, but also distributors, Apple, Google, Spotify. If you have not already subscribed, left a positive review, please do. The links are in that link tree. Again, I'm Ben Dubose, editor of USA Today's Rockets Wire. As always, I appreciate you guys so much for listening, and please come back soon for more new episodes of The Logger Line. Go Rockets.